Hello and good morning, everyone. Um, I am here to be your moderator for this session. My name is Jasmine Verdi. Before I give an introduction to the speaker, I'll give a brief introduction to myself. So I work for a publishing company called Synergetic Press. We publish books on psychedelics, consciousness, and ecology. We're actually co-publishing a Chacruna anthology this year, which is coming out in August. We have a booth in the expo, and you can find details about the book there, and it's actually being offered at a 20% discount for Chacruna audiences. It is called Psychedelic Justice, and it covers issues like race, diversity, gender, reciprocity, and all of those kinds of things. I'm currently speaking to you from San Miguel de Allende in Mexico, which is where I live. I also closely collaborate with Chacruna. I've been writing a series of articles for them about speakers for this conference. And I just want to thank you all for being here today. So we will be having a talk by Leor Roseman, who is a postdoc researcher at Imperial College London. He received his master's in research and PhD under the supervision of Robin Carhart Harris and Professor David Nutt. Today he will be talking to us about his research, an observational study conducted with Israelis and Palestinians looking at ayahuasca for peacebuilding through an observational study. And so without further ado, I introduce you to Leor Roseman. Leor?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Cool, thank you. Thanks for the introduction. So I'll just say for my presentation, I'd like to acknowledge Nadim Karkabi, who is a Palestinian anthropologist from the University of Haifa. He's my partner in crime for the next presentation. It's mainly based on a paper that we wrote together, and I'm going to send to publication soon. There are a few other people involved, but I'll mention them along the way. But first of all, thank you for Nadim for his contribution in this work. So we'll start with a vision. The vision happened in Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is the holiest day for Jewish people. It's the day of reparation. It's the day of forgiveness, and it's the day of fasting. And in this ritual of mainly Jewish Israelis, there are a few Palestinians who joined the ritual. Just a moment. Okay, there are a few Palestinians who joined the ritual, and Rukaya is one of these Palestinians. And in this ritual, she has a strong vision, and in the vision, she sees her daughter being lost into darkness. Her daughter is relatively assimilated to Israeli culture. She goes to Israeli school. She went fasting with her friend in Yom Kippur, and she also thinks of joining the army. And she kind of Rukaya tries to pull her daughter from the darkness, try to save her. And then there's a cut in the vision, and she sees a strong vision, which is apocalyptic, of war and fire and conflict. And in this vision, she sees intergenerational war from the past into the future with an apocalyptic warning for the future. She sees mothers who sacrifice their own children to the land. She sees the bleeding land, the land of Israel and Palestine. She sees the bleeding land. She feels the pain of the land, and she starts to embody the land and the pain of the land. And when she embodies that pain, she says that she suddenly had to release a frequency of anger to the rest of the group, and she sings to the rest of the group in strong confidence as delivering a message. She feels that it feels for her like she's a messenger in that moment, speaking through to the group. And she's singing El Fatiha. It's the opening paragraphs of the Quran, and she's singing that prayer with confidence and the anger of the messenger. And she tries to tell to the other participants that Yom Kippur is not just about fasting, it's about reparation as well. And reparation has a political context as well, which is stopping the oppression of Palestinian people. So this experience and process from revelation to delivery was quite unique our observation. We went to a road trip, a few months long road trip, together with Antoine Saka, who's a Palestinian activist, and Allen Ginsberg from MAPS that joins for a few days. And we interviewed Israelis and Palestinians who drink together, mostly in groups which are, the majority are Jewish Israeli. And in these groups, many people believe that ayahuasca can bring peace because it can connect people. It's about oneness and unity. But the context was very apolitical. It was pushing politics aside. It was trying to deny political tension. So the idea is that mysticism unifies while politics divide. This is something we heard a lot from our interviewees. And this is, of course, related to Western psychedelic use, in which the mystical union and oneness and unity are kind of the main experiential tenets of the practice. So the idea of harmony and oneness is prevailing in New Age and neo-shamanic practices and in therapy as well. But there are many other psychedelic experiences, and revelations are one of them, and specifically political revelations. So we know that ayahuasca has a political history and other psychedelics as well. So ayahuasca in the Amazon has a long political history. Peyote in Central and North America has a long political history. And of course, LSD in the 60s, also the politics of it are kind of more obvious. But when psychedelics kind of moved to the West, and the kind of recent renaissance is a bit more apolitical than it used to be. So when I think about political revelation, we can think about the archetype of the prophet. So compared to the archetype of the mystic, who is about acceptance beyond good and bad, beyond space and time, beyond history, he's very ahistorical, not about injustice, but about compassion, all compassion to all, and acceptance. The archetypical prophet is speaking about injustice, is speak about socio-political. The socio-political realm can bring criticism, can speak about good and evil. And these, of course, are the archetypes, but they, of course, merge more than this just separation. And we see these type of political revelations, especially, like I said, with the vision of Rukaya. She released a frequency of anger during her session. So we use the theory of Alain Badiou. Badiou talks about, he has a theory which is a politicized philosophy. It's quite complex, but I'll try to keep it very simple. In this theory, reality is an infinite, and there are many parts which are built into other parts and built from other parts. And in any situation, we need to structure it. So there's the structure of the situation, but every structure is also excluding some elements. Every structure will always be in some way exclusive. So we cannot see parts which are not part of the structure. But Badiou says that there are moments which are events, and the events are the rupture of the structure. We suddenly recognize something which is beyond the structure, something which is concealed by ideology, by language, by social hierarchies, and we can suddenly see it. And when people recognize events, they recognize the excluded, they can develop loyalty to the event, they can develop a mission in life in order to include what was excluded. And this Badiou calls fidelity. So that's the procedures that follow the event. These are more revolutionary procedures and their nature, and they try to restructure the whole structure in order to include the event. So what I'm going to argue in this presentation is that the rituals that we observe, the structure mirrors Israeli society in which Palestinian identity is excluded. And this was happening also in the rituals that we observe. But there are moments which are events, and in this case, ayahuasca-induced events, that breaks that kind of top-down influence of the structure and reveal the history of injustice towards Palestinian. But of course, when this happened, the structure will be able, and we will see that, to oppose the fidelity, to oppose the event, and kind of try to deny it. So we argue in our paper with Nadim that these type of processes from revelation and that leads to a revolutionary motion, these are in the heart of many processes of diffusion and diversification of the practice. So we observed Jewish Israelis ritual. The ayahuasca rituals came from the Amazon more than 2 decades ago, and in Israel they become, or with many Jewish and Israeli elements, of course, and there's like quite a lot of beautiful ways in which Judaism intersects with the practice. And then Palestinians start joining those ceremonies recently. So Palestinians in the last few years, especially the Palestinians who live in Israel, the socio-economical status, the middle social class is kind of increasing, and they're seeking more of such thing, more engaged with New Age spirituality, with psychedelic practices, and so on. So for them, it can be a moment, a psychedelic practice can be a moment of self-liberation from these tensions of being subjugated or being always in the prism of the Palestinian identity. For example, Sasson, a Palestinian woman from Israel, says that during a session, everything fades. There's like an identity dissolution. There's no such thing as Muslim or Jewish or Christian. Everything fades and only acceptance and love stays. She also gave another interpretation for oneness and for human connection, and she says that, yes, everybody can bring his own prayer, the Muslim prayer, the Jewish prayer, the Christian prayer, or bring from their own culture, and every unique culture has its own color and frequency, and oneness is the unity of all these frequencies. So imagine a rainbow that becomes a white light. So this is similar to discourse of interfaith and intercultural dialogue groups, but in many times these discourses are excluding the national identity, as this one is in the heart of the conflict. So Israelis, the Palestinians who live in Israel have been denationalized for decades. They are referred to as Israeli Arabs. They like if they present their Palestinian identity, it might seem like a betrayal in the Israeli state. Therefore, the Palestinian identity is denationalized for Palestinians who live in Israel. So when people go to dialogue groups, Palestinians and Israelis, or any other dialogue groups, there's usually like a dynamic which is quite common, in which those in power, if there's a subjugated, subjugator, or oppressor, oppressed, the oppressed would seek, the one from the side of the oppressed would seek to speak as an individual to individual. Just let's all be friends. Let's kind of have harmony and friendship and celebration. And let's speak as people, person to person, not represents our collectives. While the oppressed would speak about decolonization, would speak about conflict, would speak about representing of the collective. So within the practices that we observe, New Age kind of came in order to, in a way that preserved the power of the oppressed, in this case, the Israeli. As New Age kind of epitomizes and glorifies a lot of times unity, oneness, and personal healing, and many times it's kind of in opposition to energies that are in direct activism, in which anger is required, in which conflict is required, and they're in opposition in process which are more collective. So New Age in a way can preserve a certain power dynamic that exists. And in this way, oneness is actually stabilizing the status quo. It's stabilizing the structure of the Israeli ritual. But as we said, with Badiou's theory, events can happen, a rupture of the structure can happen, and we observed few of those. And in those structures, the excluded Palestinian identity is suddenly revealed strongly, and that leads to a certain procedures that follow. I'll give 2 examples in this talk. So Khalil is a Palestinian. He defines himself as Jewish Israeli. He grew up in Israel in a Jewish Israeli educational system. He even considered to join the Israeli army. And he says that until he did the ayahuasca, he was very much brainwashed from the Israeli system. So in his ayahuasca session, he started by going to heal his personal trauma. And after a few sessions, he go to drink with Israeli group in a ceremony that's very, very strongly Jewish oriented. So most of the ceremonies have Jewish influences, but this ceremony was quite unique. It was very Jewish oriented. It was in a Friday evening, a Kabbalat Shabbat. It was lots of Jewish prayers, and everybody dressed in white, and quite like a beautiful celebration. But Khalil came dressed in a jeans and colorful clothes, and he felt excluded. He was asked to change to white clothes. He felt excluded, He felt separated from the group, he felt alienated, and he went to sit outside in the porch. So while he sits in the porch, he feels like he's losing his own mind. He's becoming mad. He's losing his sanity, and he's afraid that he will stay like this forever. He's almost also very much lonely, very much separated, and not belonging to the space. So while he is in that situation, he wants to pray for God for help, and he kind of, from being very depressed, he lifts his head up to pray to God. And in the porch, in the other side, in the house in front of him, he sees two Palestinians in his revelation, in his vision. And these Palestinians, they wear the traditional indigenous Palestinian clothes, and they speak to Khalil very kindly and very softly. And they speak to him and they tell him, Khalil, we know that you grew up in the Jewish-Israeli system. We know that you even hate Arabness, you hate your own background. But we just want to let you know that this house, beautiful house in which you're sitting and doing this ceremony, this is actually a Palestinian house. We lived here before 48, and we were displaced from this house by Jewish people. So this is, of course, a reminder of the Nakba, the catastrophe of Palestinian people, in which many Palestinians were displaced from their homes at 48. So the returning home of Jewish people to the land of Israel consists also of the displacement of Palestinians from their home. So he kind of becomes quite angry, mainly angry at himself for the years of brainwash, and he returns to the ceremony in anger, and for the first time he sings in the ceremony for confidence, but in a way that tries to break the harmony. So he becomes disharmonic on purpose, tries to say to the rest of the group that in fact this is a Palestinian house, whether we like it or not. So he brings a lot of political energy to the space in that moment, but the facilitator, the Jewish-Israeli facilitator at the time, is wise and kind of tries to reverse that energy. He invites Khalil to sit next to him, and then he sings another beautiful Arabic song, but a much more celebratory song, and suddenly all of the session becomes an Arab celebration, everybody dancing to Arabic music, everybody actually are hugging Khalil and telling him that they love him, and there's a lot of emotional affection and connection at the moment. But what also happened is that Khalil came with political anger that's related to the injustice conflicted of Palestinians. So he brings the national identity. What the facilitator does is reverse that by kind of going to the cultural element, to the kind of universal Arab, the pan-Arabic, and becomes a cultural celebration of Arabness, but not about the conflict with Palestinians. So there's a certain reversal which the structure kind of preserves itself, but Khalil is kind of persistent, and he continues in loyalty and fidelity to this moment of revelation, to the event. He says this is the moment where his journey began. He became unbrainwashed at the moment. He became clean to receive the truth. And he still holds strong universalistic worldview. He says that it didn't flip it entirely. He's not right now hates Jewish people. He kind of understands the situation. But his attempt is now, he's not wanting to join anymore as a minority Jewish-Israeli ceremonies. So he tries to create ceremonies which are half-half balanced, but he mainly creates ceremonies only for Palestinians, in which Arabic music can be celebrated as Palestinian music, and in Arabic language is a Palestinian language as well. So these ceremonies are kind of empower Palestinians to be in a ceremony which they're not only need the help or relying on the experience of the Jewish Israelis, but they have their own place of practicing. So while he kind of serves only Palestinians at this moment, he still believes that this is part of a universalistic mission, and it's the energy of a universal emancipation of humanity, which is in his case related to Palestinians. So this is something which is important in Badiou's theory. So once the rupture of the structure happened and event is observed, the event is a particular excluded part. But because it's beyond the structure, there's also a universalistic energy in this. So Khalil, while he works with Palestinian, he still works with a universalistic aim, which is related to emancipation of humanity in large. That's the excitement of his work. And with that energy, he becomes a key player of diffusing the ayahuasca practice to many Palestinians and also other psychedelic practices later on. So with his mission and confidence and fidelity, loyalty to the event, he becomes a key player in the diffusion of the practice. But he still holds a strong apolitical worldview. And still find it challenging to confront larger political structures. Now, the story of Rukaya is quite different because she starts to find slowly also political energy in her practice. So Rukaya, as we said, she sang in Yom Kippur from El Fatiha, from the Quran, and she released the frequency of anger from her revelation. And but while she was angry about the injustice of Palestinians, she held a universalistic message. When I asked her what is the meaning for the opening of the Quran for her, she said that all those who go by certain laws which are illusionary and fake separate from the human itself, from humanity, from what we are. We are human. So, and again, that emancipation or the energy that now to include the particular in the structure, to bring the particular in the structure, holds also a universalistic kind of energy. But she says many friends denied and rejected her message at that same evening, rejected in anger, rejected her political truth, what she was trying to say. A few friends followed her later and also became musicians that help her while she started conducting her own ceremonies. So the one way that, again, the structure, the Jewish structure can reverse the event of the Palestinian event is by personalizing the process. So if before I said that Khalil is that harmony was in service of making the state apolitical and serving the status quo, now I'll give an example of how arguing for personalized process prevents a collectivizing of certain struggle. So, for example, Neil, who is known in these circles, is Jewish Israeli facilitator, very kind, very wise facilitator, very respected. When I asked him about those visions, political visions, and the anger that follows them, he said that these are the shadow work of each person, which means each person needs to confront with his own political history and background, and therefore by that kind of liberating himself from these identities and tension. So this is kind of like a cathartic moment, or like an anger management moment, in which one is confronting with something only in order to know himself better and know how to work with these parts of him better. But in Near explanation, what he reduces, that's the expression of anger or the expression of their political truth of Palestinian injustice, is also addressing the other group. It's a collective energy. It's not just a personal process. Their political criticism is addressed to other people. It's not just part of a personal healing, it's part of collective processes. By reducing it only into personal healing, to the shadow work, and Near is also preventing from an energy, revolutionary energy maybe, even to unfold and to challenge the status quo. So Rukaya still continues with her mission in loyalty to the event. With her mission, she tries to liberate the Arabic language from the oppression of the Israeli state. She works a lot with women in ceremonies, try to bring them to sing as well in ceremonies. She believes that women are those who would bring the revolution or the liberation, and therefore she works mainly with women. So her kind of hegemonic processes are also oriented to the Israeli state, but also oriented to patriarchy. But her process of politicization is slow, and while she becomes a key kind of player in the diffusion of the practice to Palestinians, also to Palestinians in Israel, and also to Palestinians in the West Bank, her process of politicization is slower. She's still part of the neo-shamanic, the New Age circles. She still very much believes in unity and love and peace and oneness and friendship and human connection. But she tries to politicize it slowly and give a space also for anger and discussing political injustice. It's hard for her to find like-minded people, and that's a slow process that she's finding those people and also help her reveal her truth to other people which understand her. So in one of the sessions with those like-minded people, she continues to practice a politicized spirituality. And one example is that in the middle of a session, in a moment of strong inspiration, she speaks in archaic Hebrew, in biblical Hebrew, and she in criticism towards Israel, Jewish Israelis. And she says something like, the children of Israel, those who were oppressed by Pharaoh, those who were liberated by Moses, are now become the oppressor of Palestinians. So she finds this kind of spiritual way of speaking in a ceremony about political, conflictual tensions, and to even in her own way reform the hold of, in the New Age hold of like harmony and unity, oneness, and try to bring other energies into the ritual. So these are two examples. There are a few more, but what we can see here that there are political revelatory events. Of course, psychedelics are not just about unity and oneness. There are other energies involved, and we argue that this is part of the revolutionary potential of psychedelics. There's also beside the acceptance and the love, there's also a revolutionary potential, which is about not just acceptance, but it's about resistance as well. And that energy, we argue that loyalty to the event and the fidelity, the procedures that follows, is in the heart also of the diffusion and diversification of the practice. And there are a few historical examples like this. For example, Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs, they came back from the Amazon after doing Yahe in the Amazon, and they came back to Leary, and they told him all about the ritual and the curandero and the practices in the Amazon. Leary liked that idea. Leary at the time was a professor at Harvard, was still not, he still was part of the exclusive academic and governmental practices of the time. So there was no large movement yet. And Leary get excited and he leads the ceremony for Ginsberg. In that ceremony, Ginsberg has a strong messianic opening, a messianic revelation of world peace. He starts running naked in the apartment. He wants to call on the phone all world leaders and told them, let's spread psychedelics to all. And of course, this is an intense moment, an intense rupture. And then Leary and Huxley Leary and Ginsberg decide to follow that. Up to that time, Leary was Huxley's protege. They were in strong relationship, but Huxley held a strong elitist view, in which psychedelics are only for the few and for philosophers, scientists, academics, artists, but they cannot go for the people. The psychedelics were quite exclusive, and that moment of rupture, the revelation of Ginsberg, was also a moment that started a certain movement which brought psychedelic to much wider universalistic psychedelics to the people. Of course, many movements have begun at the same time, Ken Kesey and Marek Pranksters as well, but this is kind of part of the energy that follows certain revelations. Santo Daime has also historically some of these revelations which created large movement, diversification, diffusion of the practice. So such events are important for the emergence of counter-hegemonic egalitarian sentiments, but persistence is required in order to manifest them. The structure would always oppose. In our case, the Israeli structure has been using maybe sometimes even fetishizing unity or oneness or personal healing instead of resistance as well, and collective healing as well. So the structure would find its way to oppose those truths of events. So therefore, persistence is required. So because fidelity can be reversed, the revolutionary charisma can be routinized, and in the end, the event becomes a routine. It doesn't hold that revolutionary energy anymore. But those subjects to the event, they might still want to act upon their truth. And if that is the case and they don't succeed to change the structure around them, they might choose to drop out. right? So that's quite common. Many of the Israelis and Palestinian interviewees that we interviewed are actually planning to move to Portugal or Costa Rica, find a community in nature, do psychedelics where it's legal, live in nice equality, connected to nature, and away from all the political tensions. And this is a struggle that didn't manage to fulfill itself. There's a preference to dropping out. But fidelity also can be hijacked by the structure itself. It can become pseudo-fidelity. It's a structure kind of takes the fidelity, the revolutionary energy for its service. It can be recognized with this revolutionary motion, a motion of like for liberation, but it's non-universal. It's not about all people. It's not directed towards other people, but it's directed to the exclusive few. So maybe ideas like conspirituality, which is in the next session. Ali, my neighbor and friend, is presenting, and Adam, my friend as well, and they might speak about stuff like this. So I'll finish by saying that there are other types of events. There are events, not just political events, the political event of equality for all, but there are scientific events with the ideas of new enlightenment, the artistic event with the new perceptual intensity, and the events of love with the new existential intensity. So any study that wants to investigate, and I'll probably continue that, investigate psychedelic events, should always investigate the structure and situation in which they happen, the moment of the rupture, and the moment of fidelity, the revolutionary motion that follows. I hope that what I said made sense, and that I sparked some curiosity, maybe that I even confused some of you, and some assumptions, and maybe recharged hope in case it's faded for you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Leor. It's such a fascinating and, I guess, fringe subject in the psychedelic renaissance or in psychedelic research. And I think it's a really important to learn how we can use psychedelics to navigate systemic oppression. And yeah, so we have some really great questions in the chat. So I'll start reading them. First off, there's one by Richard Grossman. He says, it seems like there is a built-in power imbalance in the ceremonies, as they are, quote, mostly Jewish. Have you considered having an outsider, e.g. South American or North American facilitator? And he adds to this by by stating, this would have less of a power dynamic going on. I was wanting to do this many years ago in Israel, and in fact did a couple such ceremonies there.
Sure. So so again, what we presented and what I presented is observational research. Some of the ceremonies were led by Israelis, but some of them led by European, and the idea of maybe South American or somebody or some ceremonies are led by also Mexicans if they're peyote ceremonies. So definitely that helps, but not entirely. So again, the power dynamic is not just the main facilitator. It's those who are Israelis are more experienced with the music, so the musicians and the helpers, and also kind of the New Age spirituality has much more history in Israel than for Palestinians. So there's a cultural capital as well that's stronger for Israelis. The language of the ceremony, if there's a majority of Israelis, the language of the ceremony or the language that people would speak would be Hebrew. So even if you bring somebody from outside, there will be certain dynamics that exist. But I guess those dynamics are also important, and there's no need to completely deny them because they bring a certain energy. They represent reality as is. So creating a space which is completely equal, while reality is not equal, can maybe even create an illusion of equality. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And the next one from Scott and Krista Engel. What is the history of ayahuasca use in Israel? Does it start with Benny Shannon?
I think before. I think there's no clear research on that. There's at least 2 decades, even more, of ayahuasca in Israel, probably starting with Santo Daime and Santo Daime practices, but recently more kind of Peruvian style practices. So in Israel, there's a strong separation between, they call it like Brazilian, the in light, the kind of communal practices, and the Peruvian in darkness, kind of going personal through shadow kind of work practices. But in reality, they're mixed, and a lot of times they're participatory elements and Jewish Israeli elements, and now Palestinian elements as well.
Great, thank you. And another question from Rachel Leah Bello. Curious if the facilitator was Jewish Ashkenazi or Jewish Arab Mizrahi. Also curious about the proportion of Arab Mizrahi Jews to Ashkenazi among the participants.
So again, we observed few groups. I can try to tell you, there is a Mizrahi one of the main groups, the facilitator. One is a woman, which I'm not actually sure. One is actually a Palestinian facilitator. One is a European facilitator. So a mix. Yeah, a mix. Around the participants, these are groups which are drinking on a, maybe I didn't give too many details on the groups, but they're drinking on a constant basis, like it's a constant practice. It's not just a retreat with the same facilitators and help. Actually, the participants are returning. There's communities that built around those practices. And I think, probably I would say that there's more Ashkenazi because the socioeconomical status of people who join ayahuasca ceremonies in Israel is usually kind of high-ish, so more Ashkenazi, but I'm not sure about it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And another one by Thomas Wanama. Do you anticipate the development of transcendent religion blending elements of Abrahamic traditions with shamanism or co-option of entheogens by sectarians or state suppression of entheogens in Israel?
Sorry, I didn't understand the second part of the question.
Yeah, I might have to read it again too. So the development of transcendent religion blending elements of Abrahamic traditions with shamanism or co-option of entheogens by sectarians of state or suppression of entheogens in Israel.
So definitely there's a fusion in some of the groups that we observe. There's strong fusion of religious elements and kind of an attempt to create a religious dialogue in this place of the Abrahamic religions. Again, this is what, as I said, it's not necessarily in service of the conflict, as the conflict a lot of times is on national grounds and not just the religious grounds. But definitely, there's in some of the press ceremonies, like one Jewish person can bring something from the Kabbalah, and then immediately after there's from the Quran, and there's like a dialogue between those traditions in which mysticism and shamanism are the kind of center which discourse and unifies. The second part, I'm not sure. Definitely, the state can decide to shut things down. I think if they want, but it's not very clear right now. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And another question. Sorry. Another question from Heidi Berg. How can we facilitate psychedelics/plant medicine sessions to hold space for collective shadow work around oppression and power dynamics?
Yeah, so I think there are ways which kind of exploring the people I'm working with, exploring ways of what kind of things can be good for this. And there are ways of things to do with groups in the preparation that bring into the ceremony themselves certain mindsets. Of course, you don't want to bring the conflict full on and have a ceremony which you're all only kind of challenge, or maybe you do, I don't know. But there are ways, kind of soft ways that to work with politics, and those who are have a background in doing dialogue groups or doing intergroup contact and discussing these stuff in groups. There are certain practices that can bring this into the mindset. So the idea that the personal is political is obviously known, but we don't necessarily embody that feeling that we are political beings at the moment. There's certain practices that can really bring that into awareness, and if they're done before going into a session together, they continue in the session to something which is quite collective, political, spiritual.
Yeah,
I have examples, but I won't go into details of the method, I guess.
I also had a question to build on Heidi's question, and it was about integration in this kind of work, because I would imagine that, you know, these ceremonies are kind of going on underground, so there's not necessarily like a formal integration. But if you were to, I don't know, formalize this kind of research and take it beyond beyond what you're doing now, I mean, what kind of integration protocols could one have dealing with this kind of work?
Yeah. So first of all, the groups that we observed have their own integration. As I said, many of them, they meet on a regular basis. They create a community which is integrating itself and supporting each other. But again, the groups we observed were very apolitical, so they don't engage in activism and stuff like this. I believe that it can go to a step with more in political involvement, in maybe taking ideas from sacred activism, activism which is related to indigenous connection to the land, so kind of combining politics with environmentalism. Things like this can be ways of working with integration with the kind of this political energy if it rises in the session. So finding a way of a collective that's been in the ceremony together, finding a way of how it acts later on is probably a healthy integration. And that should be in some way related to what they experience together in the session and how they want to manifest it together in reality. Few groups maybe can meet also each other, try to create a stronger collective. But I guess the integration in this case is through action. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And I have another question from CJ Healy. How does the awareness of ceremony taking place on occupied land, for example, America, Israel, affect the different experiences of the settlers and the colonialized people sitting in ceremony together?
So yeah, the land is crucial in many of the experiences, and the land is, as I said, the vision of Rukaya, in which I started with, was a vision of the bleeding land and the suffering of the land. And few other Palestinian women, so there are 4 Palestinian women which we interviewed that shared that pain of the land, and embodying, seeing the blood of the land and trying to heal it as well. So there's something in the practice that kind of calls maybe for the indigenous connections for the land for both sides. So for their ceremonies also of Jewish settlers in the West Bank, which are very exclusive, they don't have Palestinians. And we spoke with some of them, not officially interviewed them, but it seems that it also brings that indigenous connection to the land of Jewish people, but without including the Palestinians in this land. So whenever Jewish and Israelis are, and you know, the conflict in Israel-Palestine is about who's indigenous in a way, you know. Jewish were indigenous 2,000 years ago, and now we're returning home and moving the current indigenous from their place. So it's like, who's indigenous? And the land, and being there, like hearing the airplanes fly while you do a ceremony in the desert, hearing the muazzin from a mosque kind of reminding you of the conflict, doing the practice where you did your training in the army, all of that is quite loaded in the space, and I think it calls for a reconnection with the land once Israelis and Palestinians are in the same space together, and how indigenousness of indigeneity of both can in a way be together, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And M. Cohen asks, can you speak to ceremonies that are being done in West Bank or Gaza, Muslim and Christian or both? What can you say about these?
I don't know too much. I know of like a ceremony that was mainly Palestinians in West Bank, a few, 3 Jewish in that ceremony. But I didn't explore ceremonies of Palestinians only. So I don't really know too much. They're rare. They're rarer than in Israel, but they kind of exist. Yeah. and many times they don't want to be open to Israelis or to discourse with Israelis, the Palestinians in the West Bank.
Okay, that makes sense. And Thomas Buonamo also asks another question. How do Latin American indigenous groups engage in psychedelics for conflict resolution between warring tribes? Are there any good published resources on this subject?
Yeah, I was trying to find some stuff like this. The historical kind of political use of ayahuasca many times was in opposition in the Amazon towards the white colonizer. So ayahuasca can be used in a way to also create a sense of indigeneity and identity and connection to land, the unity between tribe members in opposition to white colonizer, alliances between tribes, because this is needed also as a force of resistance. But there are few stories of actually inter-tribe reconciliation practices. I just heard about them and not research. So I heard, for example, that they can start with a strong like conflictual energy. There's a shaman who's expert in like reconciliation with ayahuasca, and they can start with a strong conflictual energy that is released during the session. There are few mentions of this in research, but not. I didn't see a proper research on this. Yeah.
And are you concerned about the continuing globalization of plant medicines resulting in new forms of power imbalances as opposed to establishing the groundwork for an equitable future for all?
Yeah, for sure. Also psychedelic practices, and yeah, it's I'm not an expert at that. I just read and hear other people talks, and I'm sure other people have smarter things to say than what I have to say. But yeah, I'm definitely worried about that these were not necessarily change the structure to become more equal, but they would be in service of those who are already in power. There will be like the Soma, like what Aldous Huxley called Soma in Brave New World, maybe a spiritual practice that is kind of escaping from the alienation of our world, and but just a momentary practice that kind of serves the status quo to continue with its own hierarchy and dynamics and so on. Yeah. So I think it might go there. There's definitely a strong trajectory that many are worried about, that this would go to this direction.
Yeah, I guess also there are many big pharma companies developing trip-free psychedelics, so the mystical experience is kind of being extracted out of them. Okay, so we have another question from Jesse Duke. What is the makeup of people who are joining? City dwellers, rural, rural from out of the city people? I felt there was a difference in Israel around openness / feelings towards depending on where people lived.
I think mixed, definitely city people, but also there are few kind of more hippie regions in Israel, so people from these places, but definitely mixed. Yeah.
And okay, so I have one more question, which is my own, and I'm curious about the barriers to this kind of research. I would imagine that potentially Orthodox Jews and Orthodox Muslims are wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable with the idea of taking psychoactive plants. So I'm just curious how that acts as a barrier.
Oh, I think Orthodox Jews, at least, there's a lot of psychedelic use for Orthodox Jews, also in Israel, but also outside of Israel. With Muslims, I know less about it, but there is some ayahuasca practices of Muslims in Iran, I think, things that I read about, but not a lot. Definitely, there's the conservatism, the religious conservatism that would oppose such things. But I would worry more of actually New Age conservatism and academic conservatism than the religious conservatism to prevent that. Because if the practice that, a potential practice that can happen, which is a bit more political, and a practice that can bring the ideas of injustice and that these tensions into the practice, so politicizing the practice. So there's also the forces of like Western spirituality, which try to stay very much apolitical, and there's also the force of science, which try to stay very much apolitical, so psychedelic science. So these are also conservative in their own way and might prevent a practice for developing in certain directions. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Leor. We really appreciated you having here and sharing about those experiences and your research. As I said, it's such an important and valuable topic, especially for times when we find the world so divided. So thank you so much. And,
thank you. Thanks for moderating. It was excellent.
Yeah, thank you everyone for being here as well. Have a lovely afternoon or morning. Bye.
Bye.